Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering No Hat for Pat and Toy Store of Doom. I think these are two episodes that are somewhat disliked, but not especially so or anything like that, just slightly negative reputations. Also, they are potentially forgettable episodes, but I'm also inclined to think otherwise since I actually remember them both decently well. So basically, the bottom line is that I'm not entirely sure what to make of these two episodes here in this introduction, which I guess is a sign that I should just move on to the part where I say thank you to everyone watching, right? Well, now that I've said that, how about I just get right into it? Starting us off today is the episode that I always mistake Pat No Pay for, No Hat for Pat. So, back when I reviewed Pat No Pay in October, I said that it was probably better than No Hat for Pat, though that wasn't a very confident opinion since I hadn't revisited No Hat for Pat in a while and couldn't remember my feelings on the episode. Now that I have done that necessary revisiting, I can say with certainty that I was definitely off the mark. Yeah, I like this episode more than Pat No Pay, and let me tell you why. Or indirectly tell you why, because I'm of course just gonna talk about this episode on its own merits. So, one thing about No Hat for Pat is that it has a very similar plot to New Student Starfish, and before anyone says anything, I see nothing wrong with that. I just don't see a point in pretending like there aren't clear similarities here. Patrick takes issue with SpongeBob being taken away from him by work, just like how in that episode SpongeBob is occupied by class. Though here, Patrick is really more focused on SpongeBob's hat than his job, which is a fun twist playing into Patrick's absent-mindedness. No Hat for Pat starts out well, with SpongeBob and Patrick's exchange about work and hats. If only taking off my work uniform meant that I didn't have to go. Oh, that would be the dream. Also, this episode has made me realize the inherent absurdity of the Krusty Krab work hat, because why is it so tall? That's so cute, honestly. And it's such a frequent addition to SpongeBob's design that I usually forget that it's even there. Anyway, I love the way Bill Fagerbakke delivers Patrick's lines in this beginning scene, especially at the end of it. Just like the way he says, "I'll get a job and a hat," makes me laugh. So this is a very strong beginning for the episode. And the episode continues on this good streak as it goes on. I like how quickly paced the next bit of No Hat for Pat is, with Mr. Krabs and the Taurus, and then Patrick just happening to be standing outside. Seeing Patrick standing around doing nothing reminds me a lot of Big Pink Loser, which is another episode that this episode reminds me of in general. And then the way Patrick keeps failing at the sign job is pretty amusing as well, and I like how encouraging Mr. Krabs is in this segment towards Patrick. It's better than him immediately hating on the guy. I don't know, it just makes me happy to see. Finally, Patrick gets the hat he'd been oh so coveting, and he just falls over. Okay, so firstly, No Hat for Pat surprises me, well, as surprised as I can be given that I've seen this episode many times, in giving Patrick a hat so soon, especially thinking of the title of this episode. Like, I'd expected this episode to follow a plot more similar to Big Pink Loser or Pat No Pay, where Patrick tries and fails to earn a hat, or Mr. Krabs realizing that he can use the hat as an incentive to get Patrick to work. But nope, this episode switches gears to Patrick's center of gravity being thrown off by the hat. And I've got no problems with this at all. It keeps things interesting, and it's kind of cute that Patrick forgets how to stand when he's nervous. And once some random people come over and start laughing at Patrick, well, the remaining plot of this episode becomes very clear very quickly. And this is also where the one real issue I've got with No Hat for Pat comes in. After such a strong start with these great varied gags, we are now relegated to this one gag that hardly counts as slapstick for a few too many minutes. At least Squidward and his great quips provide some variety here. Also, the townspeople in this episode are just weird because who pays to see some guy fall over? And yeah, Mr. Krabs is morally bankrupt, blah blah blah. I feel like y'all should know now, or at least should know by now, that this is rarely a problem for me, and this episode doesn't show any differences in that specific attitude of mine. Sometimes it's fun to see the level of depravity that Mr. Krabs will stoop to, and in terms of Mr. Krabs' worst showings, this episode is quite tame. The other issue I have with No Hat for Pat only becomes clear halfway through it, and it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because, listen, on one hand, I really like the animation and expressiveness of this episode. It feels very unlike this season and very at home in a place like Season 4. However, on the other hand, this appealing expressiveness and animation applies to every character but Patrick, who, as the episode goes on, gets drawn so weirdly with all the extra, lines on him. I don't know what else to call that, but it's weird to me. And then we get plenty of looks at his battered face, and it's very uncomfortable for me. Alright, back to things I like. So, I love how SpongeBob wants to stand up for Patrick in this episode, showing a backbone that I've been sorely missing from him. Not that SpongeBob has necessarily been a pushover lately, but it's more like we haven't had an episode with a plot where SpongeBob could stand up to Mr. Krabs, or whoever. I suppose we did have one in the Krabby Chronicle, which wasn't too long ago, and then I love how Patrick actually has a legitimate motivation in this episode beyond just whimsy, and as we reach the climax of the episode, y'all know I've just got to point out the gorgeous background here as SpongeBob walks to work. Also, this episode was the first time that I've noticed Moana playing, which is one of my favorite OSTs in the show. Not my favorite, but it's up there. This OST technically first appeared in the Fry Cook games, but you can't actually hear it there, and it apparently played in Krabs vs. Plankton, but I didn't catch it, so I'm choosing now to celebrate one of my favorite tracks showing up. We then reach the episode's climax, and I love how once Patrick takes the hat off, he can't fall correctly. Also, SpongeBob blowing his nose into that guy's hand was hilarious, if gross. Squidward continues to provide great side support in this episode, and the way he ends up falling instead of Patrick is hilarious. And I love that Patrick is the one who figures out the truth behind his falling. I think it's a nice example of one of his moments of lucidity that I like to see from him. And then Mr. Krabs ends up getting his comeuppance, which is great too. I just wish the townspeople could get some comeuppance of their own, because they're the ones who are paying to watch people get hurt. Another thing I really like about this episode is that it has an epilogue. More episodes need epilogues. Anyway, this epilogue features a gorgeous, gorgeous background, so that is an instant win for me. And this epilogue is super wholesome too, so that's another win for me. And one last great thing about this episode that I couldn't talk about anywhere else is how it handled character interactions. They didn't feel stiff like they have in some other episodes this season, but rather varied, like every character got a chance to interact with each other in a meaningful and funny way. I really liked No Hat for Pat, which completely surprised me because I thought I would dislike this episode. I'm not entirely sure where I got that idea from. Maybe it's the popular opinion, but that hardly matters considering that I know I like this episode now, and I know I like it more than the one that I mistake it for. But that could be because that episode is a short, and therefore has less time to impress me like this episode. I pointed out some key issues with this episode, but they really aren't as grave as I might have made them sound, especially the gag one, because it really only lasts for a few minutes until we get to the episode's climax, so it's okay. So, thinking of it all together now, I'll be putting this episode in my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9.3 out of 10. Toy Store of Doom is a very interesting episode, because if memory serves, this episode is seen pretty positively in general, but it also has many elements of episodes that I dislike. Like, the entire plot of this episode basically makes SpongeBob and Patrick children without an adult bone in their bodies, and y'all already know I'm not the biggest fan of that. Or maybe you don't. Well, I'm telling you now, I prefer when the child-adult line towed by this show is either even or leaning towards the adult side. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this episode is going to be bad, though. Let's see if it'll impress me. The beginning of Toy Store of Doom is boring, which is the point. That doesn't mean I have to like it, though. See, just because you can create boringness effectively does not mean it's conducive to a well-crafted episode. The fact that they were in Squidward's house the whole time was funny, though. But I mean, seriously, these first few minutes are such a drag. And then when they start crying about the store not being open, why? Why are we doing this right now? I don't want to see or hear them crying. It's borderline irritating. Thankfully, the construction worker feels the same way and throws Patrick inside the store. SpongeBob doing it to himself was also amusing. When the poor cashier dreads the possibility of SpongeBob singing, I feel them deeply, because ever since Choir Boys, let's just say that my trust in the singing in this show has gone down the drain, where it will remain until we get a good song again. And then you'll never believe what happens in this scene anyway. If you guessed annoying noises, guess what? You're right. Now, it's not as egregious as Choir Boys, not even close, but they're still there. Thankfully, everything is covered up by a time card, for the most part. Moving on, after Patrick convinces SpongeBob to hide in the store so they can stay past closing, I've gotta say that this scene takes just a bit too long for me, especially when they're leaving their hiding spot. When the lights turn off and they start freaking out, I find it to be kind of amusing. I mean, this episode is really leaning into the child aspect of things, so I guess it makes sense that they'd be afraid of the dark, I suppose. And there were a few good jokes in this part too, like Patrick not being able to hear or the night vision. Patrick's paranoia is also pretty funny because why is he even this paranoid? It's just so starkly opposed to the environment they're in, which makes it great. When SpongeBob and Patrick decide to fight back against the toy, I thought this was pretty entertaining. I love their little outfits here, and I like how even though the toy is revealed to just be a tiny robot, they end up fighting it anyway. It's a good subversion of the usual trope. And then the fact that they got all dressed up like this and then give up immediately was pretty funny. Patrick's little quip about being an interesting guy was also funny. So this section of the episode was pretty good. And then the ending of the episode is good too, with SpongeBob and Patrick running out of the store and their eyes burning because they'd been in the dark and it's light outside now. It's all so fun and dramatic, and then I love how at the very end Patrick just runs back inside the store. So, I think that my main issue with Toy Store of Doom is the fact that it feels so incomplete and empty. Like, it feels like not enough happened, which is a problem in the pacing. And I'm thinking it's probably because we spent 3 minutes with SpongeBob and Patrick being bored. The episode should have just started with them walking around while being bored and seeing the billboards. Yeah, that would remove the fun joke at Squidward's house, but it would leave more time for shenanigans at the toy store, and I think that's a good trade-off. It's hard to say how I rate Toy Store of Doom because it feels higher than okay, yet lower than good. So the question is, which tier is it closest to? Well, the main difference between okay and good is that I will seek out good tier episodes in rewatches, while okay tier episodes I do not. With this episode, I don't think I'd seek it out, particularly because of that dull beginning, which is such a drag. All of this is why I'm putting this episode in my okay tier, where it comes in with a score of 6.9 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this video with some closing thoughts of mine. Well, I suppose with Toy Store of Doom, we've ended our 4-episode run of really good episodes. Dan, I just hope that this doesn't mean we're about to go back down to mediocrity, because we were in a bit of a rut for a few episodes there as well. Another thing I was thinking about while working on these scripts is that I really couldn't think of many ways to change them from the written review versions. As a reminder, I've already reviewed every episode through Season 13 on the SpongeBuddy Mania forum, and these reviews are just the video versions of those reviews, although I do attempt to add something new to all of them since it would be rather boring for me to just copy and paste my words from nearly 2 years ago now. Wow, I can't believe it'll nearly be 2 years soon. God, time flies. Alright, I think that's all I can think of for today, so I'll go ahead and end the video here, and I'll see y'all in the next review.